North Africa, December 1942. The desert held its breath in the moments before dawn. In that suspended darkness between night and day, when even the scorpions ceased their hunting and the wind forgot to blow, Sergeant Thomas Millbrook stood outside the British 8th Army's supply depot and wondered if anyone would remember his name. He was 47 years old, ancient by military standards, with hands calloused from 30 years of janitorial work and a back that protested every morning like an old door on rusty hinges. The younger soldiers called him Old Tom, or sometimes just the Custodian, spoken with the casual dismissiveness reserved for those whose war consisted of mops and brooms rather than rifles and grenades. He'd tried to enlist in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, but the recruitment officer had taken one look at his age and his civilian occupation and handed him papers for the Army Service Corps instead. "We need men who can keep our bases running," the officer had said not unkindly. "Every soldier counts, even if you're not carrying a gun." So Thomas Millbrook became what he'd always been, invisible, the man who cleaned the latrines while heroes slept, the ghost who swept the floors while generals planned campaigns, the shadow who emptied trash bins filled with discarded tactical maps and classified memos that no one thought twice about because custodians weren't supposed to have eyes, weren't supposed to have minds capable of understanding what they saw. But Thomas Millbrook had both. The supply depot sprawled across 2 acres of desert hardpan, a collection of corrugated metal buildings and canvas tents that served as the logistical heart of Montgomery's forces in the Western Desert Campaign. By day, it hummed with activity. Trucks arriving from Cairo, supplies being cataloged and distributed, mechanics repairing vehicles, quartermasters shouting orders. By night, it became Thomas's domain, lit by scattered electric bulbs that cast jaundiced pools of light across the sand. He'd been stationed here for 9 months, ever since the tide had begun to turn at El Alamein. 9 months of cleaning, watching, and thinking, 9 months of noticing patterns that no one else saw because they were too busy fighting the visible war. Thomas pushed his cleaning cart between rows of stacked supply crates, the wheels squeaking in the pre-dawn silence. The cart contained his usual equipment, industrial cleaners, brushes, rags, and, tucked beneath a false bottom that he'd constructed himself, something else entirely. Something that would either save lives or end his own. The November battle at El Alamein had been a turning point. Rommel's Africa Corps had finally been pushed back, the seemingly invincible Desert Fox forced into retreat. The newspapers back in London had called it Montgomery's masterpiece, a brilliant tactical victory. But Thomas had cleaned the field hospital tents afterward. He'd mopped blood from canvas floors and collected the personal effects of boys who'd never see Christmas. He'd watched doctors work 30-hour shifts trying to save soldiers with wounds so terrible that morphine seemed like a mercy rather than medicine. Victory, he'd learned, was just a word that meant your side buried fewer corpses than the enemy. But during those 9 months of custodial invisibility, Thomas had also noticed something else, something that troubled his sleep and occupied his thoughts during the long, lonely hours when he pushed his mop across empty floors. The Germans were always one step ahead, not always in terms of firepower or numbers, but in intelligence. They seemed to know when supply convoys would arrive, where fuel dumps were located, which routes would be used for troop movements. At first, Thomas had dismissed it as coincidence or simple military competence. But the pattern persisted, and with each incident, more young men disappeared into the desert's hungry mouth. 3 weeks ago, Thomas had been cleaning the officers' headquarters when he'd overheard Lieutenant Colonel Harrison discussing the problem with his intelligence officer. "It's as if Jerry can read our bloody mail," Harrison had said, frustration evident in his voice. "That convoy ambush last Tuesday, they knew exactly where and when to hit us. The fuel depot raid before that, same story. We've checked for radio intercepts, examined our communications protocols, even investigated potential spies among the local population. Nothing. Perhaps they're just getting lucky, sir, the intelligence officer had suggested, without conviction. 23 men died in that convoy, Captain. I don't call that lucky. Thomas had continued mopping, eyes down, invisible as always. But his mind had been racing because he'd seen something they hadn't. Something so obvious that its very obviousness had rendered it invisible. The trash. Every evening, when the offices closed and the officers retired to their quarters, Thomas collected the rubbish, crumpled papers, empty cigarette packets, discarded reports. Standard procedure called for all classified documents to be burned in the incinerator. But human nature was predictably lazy. Officers would classify something as unimportant, toss it in the bin, and never think about it again. But what seemed unimportant in isolation could become devastatingly significant when assembled into a complete picture. Thomas had begun conducting an experiment. Instead of immediately burning the collected papers, he'd started reading them first. Supply requisition forms, maintenance schedules, patrol routes, casualty reports, even personal letters that mentioned unit movements or equipment status. Individually, none of it seemed particularly sensitive. Collectively, it formed a detailed mosaic of British operations in North Africa. And if Thomas could piece this information together, so could someone else. He'd spent 3 weeks investigating, using his custodial access to move through areas that would seem suspicious for anyone else to visit. He'd watched, listened, and slowly assembled evidence that would sound absurd if spoken aloud. The British Eighth Army was being betrayed not by a spy in the traditional sense, but by its own carelessness, and someone was systematically collecting that carelessness and feeding it to the Germans. The someone was Captain Edmund Pierce. Pierce was a logistics officer, 32 years old, Cambridge educated, from a good family. He coordinated supply distribution and had legitimate reasons to be everywhere in the depot at all hours. He was also, Thomas had discovered, a man drowning in gambling debts and ideological confusion. Thomas had found the evidence 3 nights ago while cleaning Pierce's office. The captain had left suddenly, called away to an emergency meeting, and in his haste had forgotten to lock his desk drawer. Inside, Thomas had found a notebook filled with coded entries, a schedule of nighttime meetings near the perimeter fence, and a photograph of Pierce with a woman identified on the back as Sophia Alexandria, March 42. More searching had revealed that Sophia wasn't just Pierce's lover. She was a German intelligence operative working undercover in Alexandria, and Pierce had been feeding her information for months, gathered from those seemingly innocuous, discarded documents that no one thought twice about because who pays attention to trash? The realization had struck Thomas like a physical blow. All those deaths, all that blood he'd mopped from hospital floors, all those young men's personal effects he'd cataloged and packed to send home, much of it could have been prevented if someone had simply been more careful about what they threw away, or if someone like Thomas had spoken up sooner. But who would listen to a 47-year-old custodian with no military training and no proof beyond a stolen notebook and educated guesses? In the rigid hierarchy of military protocol, men like Thomas Milbrook didn't accuse officers like Edmund Pierce of treason. They cleaned floors and stayed invisible. Except Thomas had decided that invisible men could still fight a war. The plan had formed slowly, like sand accumulating into dunes. Pierce was scheduled to make a dead drop tonight. Thomas had deciphered that much from the coded notebook. The captain would leave a package of stolen intelligence at a predetermined location beyond the perimeter, where a German operative would retrieve it before dawn. The information in tonight's package was particularly valuable, detailed specifications and deployment schedules for the new American M4 Sherman tanks that had recently arrived to reinforce Montgomery's forces. If that intelligence reached Rommel, The German tank commanders would know exactly how to counter the Shermans. More boys would die in burning metal coffins, more blood for Thomas to mop, unless someone stopped it. Thomas reached the maintenance shed at the depot's southern edge, a building he'd identified as Pierce's staging area. The lock was simple. Thomas had learned lockpicking from a fellow custodian back in London who'd had a colorful youth, and within seconds he was inside. The shed smelled of machine oil and metal shavings. In the dim light filtering through gaps in the corrugated walls, Thomas could see workbenches covered with tools, shelves stacked with spare parts, and in the corner, partially hidden behind a tarp, a metal case that didn't belong. Thomas pulled back the tarp and opened the case. Inside were documents, maps marked with British positions, supply manifests, radio frequencies, and the detailed Sherman specifications. Everything carefully organized, ready for handoff. This was the moment of decision. Thomas could take the case to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, present his evidence, and hope that a custodian's word would be believed against an officer's denial, or he could do something more certain, more final. From beneath the false bottom of his cleaning cart, Thomas removed the prototype weapon he'd been secretly developing for the past 2 months. To call it a weapon was perhaps generous. It was more accurately a modified incendiary device constructed from materials he'd scavenged from the maintenance shops and chemical supplies. Thomas had always been good with his hands. His father had been an engineer, and some of that mechanical aptitude had passed down despite a life spent cleaning instead of building. The device was simple, but effective. A modified phosphorus flare combined with a chemical accelerant designed to burn hot enough to completely destroy paper documents while minimizing collateral damage to the surrounding building. Thomas had tested it once, carefully, in a remote corner of the desert, adjusting the mixture until he achieved the right balance of heat and duration. In his hands, it felt heavier than its physical weight. If he destroyed the documents, he'd be tampering with evidence. If Pierce arrived and found them gone, he'd know someone was onto him and would likely flee or go to ground. But if the handoff was interrupted by a spontaneous fire that just happened to occur before Pierce could retrieve his package, the German operative would show up to an empty dead drop. The intelligence wouldn't reach Rommel. Lives would be saved. And a custodian would have changed the course of a battle without firing a single shot. Thomas placed the device beneath the document case, set the 15-minute delay timer, done other modification using parts from a broken alarm clock, and slipped back out of the shed. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. His hands trembled as he relocked the door. He pushed his cleaning cart back toward the main depot, moving at his usual unhurried pace. Just old Tom, finishing his nightly rounds, nothing to see here. The explosion came 14 minutes later. Not a loud bang, but a contained rush of heat and light that Thomas glimpsed from 2 buildings away. By the time he reached the maintenance shed with a fire extinguisher, appearing to rush to help, as any conscientious custodian would, the interior was an inferno of chemical fire that no amount of water or foam would extinguish quickly. Officers emerged from their quarters in various states of undress. Soldiers formed bucket brigades. Someone shouted for the motor pool to bring their fire truck. In the chaos and confusion, Thomas noticed Captain Pierce standing apart from the others, his face pale in the flickering light, watching his treason burn. The fire consumed everything: documents, case, evidence. By dawn, only scorched metal and ash remained. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison ordered an investigation into the fire's cause. The official report would eventually conclude accidental ignition, likely due to improperly stored flammable materials. There would be new safety protocols implemented, stricter rules about chemical storage. The maintenance officer would receive a reprimand. No one suspected the custodian. 3 days later, British intelligence intercepted German communications expressing confusion about a failed intelligence handoff. A week after that, Captain Pierce requested a transfer back to England, citing family emergency. His request was approved. No one wanted to keep an officer who seemed emotionally unstable after witnessing that terrible fire. The Sherman tanks deployed 2 weeks later with their tactical specifications still secret. The German tank commanders, lacking the advance intelligence they'd been expecting, were caught off guard by the Sherman's capabilities during a crucial engagement near Tripoli. The battle that historians would later record as a minor Allied victory cost fewer lives than it might have, because the enemy had to adapt their tactics on the fly rather than coming prepared. Thomas Millbrook read about it in the Armed Forces newspaper while mopping the officers' mess hall. He felt no sense of triumph, no pride in his covert victory. He'd merely done what needed doing, what no one else could do because they were too visible, too important, too busy fighting the loud war to notice the quiet one. The war continued. Thomas continued cleaning, but something had changed in those pre-dawn hours, when an invisible man had decided to become visible in the only way he knew how. He began paying closer attention to what people discarded, what they considered too trivial to secure. He started implementing his own security protocols, quietly burning documents that shouldn't have been in trash bins, relocating items that were carelessly left unsecured, accidentally spilling cleaning solution on papers that contained more information than their authors realized. He became a guardian of secrets that people didn't know needed guarding. Other incidents followed over the next months. A German reconnaissance team that somehow arrived at the wrong coordinates for a British fuel depot. An enemy ambush that waited on an empty road because someone had misread a discarded patrol schedule. Small victories, invisible victories, that added up to lives saved and advantages preserved. Thomas never spoke of what he did. He couldn't, really. Who would believe that a 47-year-old custodian was conducting his own private intelligence operation, armed with nothing but access, observation, and a willingness to see what others overlooked? The custodial staff at the depot eventually grew to include 3 more men, all selected by Thomas himself. He chose them carefully. Older soldiers like himself passed over for combat duty, men who understood that invisibility could be a weapon, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought with mops instead of guns. He trained them in his methods, how to read situations, what to look for, how to accidentally destroy or misplace things that could endanger lives. They became a network of shadows, moving through the depot's infrastructure, silently correcting the security holes that carelessness created. They never called themselves spies or intelligence operatives. They were just custodians, doing their job a little more carefully than most. By the time the North African campaign concluded in May 1943 with the German surrender in Tunisia, Thomas Millbrook had been directly or indirectly responsible for intercepting at least 17 information leaks, preventing countless British casualties, and probably saving more lives than many decorated combat officers. No one knew. No medals were awarded to custodians for mopping floors efficiently. No commendations were given for trash disposal excellence. No historians would write books about the janitor who changed battles by being thorough about what he burned in the incinerator. Thomas preferred it that way. On his last night at the North African depot, before shipping out with the 8th Army to Sicily for the next phase of the war, Thomas stood once again in that pre-dawn darkness, watching the desert hold its breath. He thought about all the young soldiers who would live to see another day because someone had paid attention to trash bins and locked doors. He thought about Captain Pierce, who disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of the British Army and would probably never face justice for his treason because the evidence had burned and no one wanted to admit that a logistics officer could do so much damage with so little. He thought about the weapon he'd built, not the incendiary device, but the weapon of attention, of caring about details, of understanding that wars were won or lost in the accumulation of small things that important people considered beneath their notice. The sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the desert gold and crimson. Another day, another war, another shift for the invisible men who kept the visible ones alive. Thomas Millbrook picked up his mop, shouldered his cart, and went to clean the officers' headquarters before the day shift arrived. There would be trash bins to empty, floors to wash, documents to carefully, quietly, secretly protect. Someone had to. And in the vast machinery of war, in the clash of armies and the thunder of artillery, in the grand strategies of generals and the heroic charges of infantry, there was a place, a necessary place, for the custodian, who understood that sometimes changing the battlefield overnight required nothing more than paying attention to what everyone else threw away. The invisible war continued. And Thomas Millbrook, custodian, age 47, continued fighting it the only way he knew how. One empty trash bin at a time, one secured document at a time, one prevented catastrophe at a time. The heroes who survived would never know his name. That was exactly how it should be, because the best weapons, Thomas had learned, were the ones the enemy never saw coming. And the best soldiers were sometimes the ones whose war consisted not of glory and recognition, but of quiet vigilance in the dark hours when everyone else was sleeping, of understanding that every piece of carelessly discarded paper could be a bullet, every unlocked door could be a breach, every overlooked detail could be a death sentence for boys who deserved to go home. So he remained invisible. He remained vigilant. And in his own way, in the way that only custodians could, Thomas Millbrook continued to change the battlefield overnight, one clean floor, one burned document, one saved life at a time. The war would eventually end. The historians would write their books. The generals would receive their medals. The soldiers would come home, or they wouldn't. And somewhere in the footnotes of history, in the margins that no one bothered to read, the custodians would continue their invisible war, protecting the secrets that careless people didn't know needed protecting, guarding the lives that important people were too busy to properly defend. It wasn't the war that movies would dramatize or that newspapers would celebrate, but it was real. And it mattered. And as Thomas Millbrook had discovered in those pre-dawn hours in the North African desert, sometimes the most profound act of heroism was simply paying attention when everyone else looked away. The sun climbed higher, the depot awakened, the war continued, and the custodian kept cleaning, kept watching, kept fighting the invisible war that never made headlines but saved lives nonetheless, because someone had to. And Thomas Millbrook, invisible soldier, silent guardian, custodian of secrets that others threw away, had decided that someone would be him, the end, in memory of all those who served in ways history never recorded, who fought battles no one saw, who changed outcomes no one attributed to them. The invisible soldiers, the forgotten heroes, the ones who kept the rest of us alive.